allow me to make a start of this cold morning here in this lovely place with this lovely water tower. So we are really in the real place. And let me also, again, I must say my thanks for being invited into a country which I think is one of the most interesting regarding the industrial heritage. In my eyes, there are two European centers of industry which have a specific role. One is Catalonia in Spain, and the other one is the Czech Republic inside the former imperial kingdom of Austria, in terms that these core zones formed the machine for development for industry. A very concentrated place within a larger national context that played the decisive role for the development. I'm very glad since many years now to have a close connection to this part of the world and to be again invited the university to give a lecture. I must start with a confession, because when I prepared this lecture some time ago, I did not yet know about the 30 minutes limitation, so I assumed automatically the university lecture duration of 45 minutes, so I will try to rush you through 150 years at least of development into early modernism, not 250 years in the whole area of industry. And start with the concept of progress or development. And when I considered what to say, a film came into my mind, the 68 film of Stanley Kubrick, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which started with a very impressive scene, namely a group of apes, of monkeys, using the first primitive tools in the form of bones, and one of those monkeys throwing the bone into the air, high up into the air, and the next picture was this, a spacecraft about 20,000 years after the primitive first use of tools. So this really illustrates the term of, well, I call it progress. Whether it has been a progress in all dimensions is another question, but say development, at least that more or less fixes it. Many years later, after those primeval apes, there were people confronted with a specific problem in the development of the first industrial buildings, namely fire, the danger of fire. There were a lot of elements that were responsible for this danger: open light, very tired workers, dust from the spinning process. So a couple of elements led to a frequent occurrence, which was the fire in the first textile mills in England. So at the threshold of the industrial development, with all that new machinery coming into the world, they had the grave problem of dealing with that danger. If you look at a pre-iron factory, you realize that everything inside was made of wood. And the factors I mentioned led to this great danger of fire, and the insurance companies didn't like this at all. So there was a big pressure on the development of building materials that were more fire resistant. And for a very long time in the Science Museum in London, you could see this wall with the remains of what was among the first buildings making this step into more progressive building materials, namely cast iron, partly also already wrought iron. These cast iron columns supported wooden beams, and those wooden beams in a first step were covered by plaster to make them more fire resistant. At the end of the 18th century, a spectacular phenomenon from cast iron was set into the world with this 1779 iron bridge in the English Midlands. So this new material really sprang into the eyes for the first time with that building. And when one of the people involved into that building of the bridge, namely William Strutt, was in London in 1791, he had to watch the fire in the Albion Mills, and that made a big impression on him. again put in front the problem of finding a building material that was fire resistant. So this is one of the main features I would like to present to you today, the development of modern building materials as a step in modernization in the field of industrial buildings. Here you have again this early system of cast iron columns and wooden beams clad with plaster to make it fire resistant. And one of the very first buildings in the early 1790s was the Milford Warehouse in the Midlands, using this new method of building. So here we are, 1790, and the system was employed from that moment on all over Britain, widely successful. One has to say they learned that also a cast iron building could be set on fire and would break down given a certain temperature reached, but still it was a big step forward employing these building materials. Here we have the oldest building that still survives today, that completely uses nothing else for a whole building but brickworks and cast iron. The Shrewsbury Marshall Benyon Bates flax mill in 1797. This is really a sensation, and it luckily survived all this. When I visited for the first time in the 1970s, it was luckily used as maltings, so the building had a new use, and that gave him a new lease of life. Now they are very carefully preparing the building. And as we watch the process of industrialization from the start, one has to say that it never respected national boundaries, that it was an international phenomenon from the beginning. So the technology early on jumped to the continent. Of course, the historians of construction will say iron was an element already used by the Romans for buildings, but as a main feature, it really started with the Industrial Revolution. So in 1811, we are here in Paris, in the famous Halles aux Blés, the grain hall near what they destroyed in the 1970s, these beautiful Les Halles, this magnificent era of market halls in Paris. And a crowning edifice from the end of the 18th century on was this Halles aux Blés, which started with a wooden cupola and then got the cast iron roof in 1811, which burned down in the 1880s, and then it got...
It's still there?
No, not the cast iron one.
Yes, it is.
No, it's in 1880.
No, all around is 1880s, but the cast iron roof was kept and is still in place.
Well, but what you see now, well, this is how they constructed it. Yeah, this is what you see now. Basically, it's the 1880s construction put on top of it. But so you have 3 generations, and 2 are still left, of this introduction of a new building material. It will get a new lease of life these days. Monsieur Pinault, who made his money with luxury goods, commissioned Tadao Ando to design a museum inside it for his collection. What I saw from the drawings is not very convincing. Mainly it narrows down the magnificent big building that it was while it was called the Bourse au Commerce all these years. A bit similar to the Iron Bridge in the 18th century. Again, making a jump from country to country, we are here in Germany on the River Rhine near the city of Koblenz. In 1830, you had this magnificent facade, again showing the new building material of cast iron clearly to the outer world. I must confess that what you see here is 1980s. They made an attempt for a World Heritage Site, but they failed justly, I would say, because it has been heavily restored. If you go inside, which we won't do now, you have the original 1830 building, a very early example of the technological transfer of a building material from England to the continent. A really big bang then, of course, was the world-famous first International World Exhibition in 1851 in London, when they decided in the last possible minute to commission Mr. Paxton, who was a gardener, the Duke of Derby, to do an entirely glass and iron building. The reason for it was entirely the quickness with which this building could be erected, and it's also a step in a new building technology, mainly the prefab method. You have this famous drawing of people sitting on a rolling scaffold, putting into place the glass frames which had been pre-produced for the building. Within a few months, this building could be erected. And another feature here, we watch here for the first time, because as easy as you could construct these buildings, you could dismantle them again and put them into another place, which happened here in London in the around 1855, where they dismantled the whole building and erected it again in Sydenham, near London. Tragically enough, this building burned down in 1936, but it is proof of another advantage of this kind of constructing technical industrial buildings. Another highlight then in this development of the new building material for industrial buildings is the Sheerness boat store of 1858, where you have a 54-meter long building entirely in cast iron and iron, in a very functional manner, designed in a very functional manner. Again, something that has survived till today. So another highlight in this development of new building materials in the industrial sphere. Then you have the translation of this building materials to other purposes other than factory building, buildings for traffic, for train traffic. The 1863 St. Pancras station, with its magnificent span of 42 meters, at the time the largest span without supporting elements here in the world. It luckily has got a new lease of life as the terminal station of the Eurostar, and you have a good opportunity to study the quality of historic industrial architecture compared to modern ones. They put a very ugly shoebox of prolongation of this station behind it. If you travel first class, you still have the privilege to step out of the train under the beautiful arch of the old St. Pancras. If you're merely second class, you have to take advantage of the very... I think they could have done a better job in combining a modern building and an historical one. But nevertheless, it was a spectacular impression for the travelers of the time to step out of the train under this gigantic span of nothing else but steel. Here we do the next step towards the end of the century. From 1863 to 1889, St. Pancras was the largest span, and then Paris came along for the World Exhibition of 89 with the Isle des Machines, with a span of, oh, I forgot the exact number, I must confess. I don't find it at the moment. 74 meters span. 74 meters. So you have gigantic steps of progress within the employment of this new building material, steel. The history of construction and of architecture still has a lot of gaps. This building was erected 8 years before the famous Fargus works in Germany, in Alfeld by Gropius, but nobody knows it. It is maybe because of the business this building was erected for, is the production of teddy bears. In the southern German city of Gingen an der Brenz, the famous Steiff concern started doing teddy bears from the early 20th century on. And in 1903, the owner of the factory, who had spent a couple of years in England, decided to introduce iron industry to German industry. And he commissioned a completely anonymous Munich construction firm to do this building in 1903. It is the first curtain wall construction in the world. When they decided to put the Fagus works that were erected 8 years later into the World Heritage List of UNESCO, they left out this building, and I feel it's a very unjust process. But if you open a book on construction history still today, you won't find any mention of this building. It was noticed very much at the time of the construction and again in the early 1930s, but then it was completely forgotten. A colleague of mine dug it up in the 1970s, but it has not found any introduction into the scholarly works on the development of steel construction. It is still there today in very good state, and you can here really clearly see the curtain wall characters. The man who wrote the application for the World Heritage List of Fagus, he said he is on the verge of detecting maybe an earlier curtain wall construction in one of the Hollywood film studios, but he hasn't made sure yet whether there might be a curtain wall building earlier than 1903. So you have another step forward here, introduced by this late 18th century introduction of iron as a building material for industrial buildings. And from here you can draw a clear line into the modernity of high-rise buildings in Chicago or New York. I found a citation here in a book on Louis Kahn's Factories for Ford. It says, "The factory building is where the 20th century was born." And that, I think, is quite a good wording of the phenomenon, that really our possibilities of doing modern architecture stems out of this early employment of iron as a building material in the late 18th century. This is one of the red lines you can draw considering modernity and industrial architecture. The other main line, in my eyes, would be the functionality, the functional character of industrial buildings introduced at a very early time when ornamentation was still a normal way of doing buildings. And you will mention him again, I saw in the script. But, well, double is better. James Maud Riches wrote this really phenomenal book in 1958, digging out the functional tradition in early industrial buildings. And that was really an interesting aspect. He was not the first to do so, I will show a minute later, but still it is a very instructive and good book on this material, showing you how early functionality was smuggled into the process of doing industrial buildings. Again, we can go back to the early 18th century in tracing this pattern. This is 1711, the Looms silk factory in Derby. A little bit of it has survived, but in comparison to the conventional architecture of the city behind it, already see the clear functionality of these very early examples of a factory building. And from here you can really draw a red line throughout the 18th century. What you see here are the remains of the oldest mechanized cotton mill in the world, Richard Arkwright's cotton mill of 1771. He brought out a patent on his water frame spinning machine, enabling him to do spinning without fingers, as it was said at the time. Of course, creating one of the problems that are still with us in the industrial age, setting people out of work. The machine Arkwright invented, it made unnecessary about 12 spinning ladies, and later even 112 spinning ladies, all at once by employing one machine to do the work of many, many people, the handwork of many, many people. That is the black side of modernization. If you look at the process of using computers and sort of making our world electronic, you have the same problem still. How many people will it put out of work? So is it progress or whatever you call it? This is 3 stories of originally 5 stories. There was a fire in the 19th century, but still you can clearly see from 1711 on till 1771 this clear language of functionality in an industrial building. Richard Arkwright was a very successful entrepreneur. Only 12 years later, he erected another factory. And what did he do? He introduced Palladian motifs into the facade of Masson Mills. So it is an ambivalent. You have this ambivalence between progress and traditional ways of constructing factories. So what I show here to outline modernity is only one side of the architectural development. You should never forget that parallel to it, you also have traditional ways of constructing factories. This is another of the many, many examples, Belper, North Mill, by showing throughout the early 19th century the going on employing this kind of architecture. Manchester was full of these big boxes, 7, 8 stories high, cotton spinning mills along canals in a very simple and functional box-like structure with many window openings. And when German architect Karl Schinkel, who had really an official standing in the Prussian kingdom, was sent to England to study examples for a museum that was intended to be erected in Berlin. He traveled industrial England as well, and when in Manchester in 1826, regarded all these factory buildings, and he criticized them very heavily, this functionalist approach. He said it was built by mere foremen without any architecture, which didn't prevent him to come back to Germany and clearly copy the cast iron method of making fireproof buildings. His famous Bauakademie, the building academy in Berlin, is quite clearly a reflection of English factory buildings he saw during this journey in 1826. I said James Maud Richardson wrote a brilliant book, but he wrote it in 1958. There were people long before him who developed the same perspective on this aspect of functionalism and modernity in industrial buildings. In 1906, 1 year before the German Werkbund was founded, which was an association of entrepreneurs, architects and producers to modernize German industry. One background for it was that they found out that German goods were not so successful in the world market, so they thought about methods of making them more attractive. So it was quite commercial intention behind the founding of this Werkbund, although it was quite primarily concerned with aestheticism in industrial buildings. 1 year before this Werkbund was founded in 1907, in the Rhineland, a group of people involved into the historic monuments business. They founded an association, the Rhenian Association for the Care of Historic Monuments. And they held a conference in 1909 in the industrial city of Wuppertal. And in this, at this occasion, they published their yearbook entirely dedicated to industrial buildings. And what is the interesting aspect, we are talking 1910, was that they together included into this journal historic industrial buildings and modern industrial buildings with a clear didactic intention to show the quality of the early, like James Maud Rich's functional tradition, and they wanted to show this functional tradition. They wanted to admonish contemporary architects, stop with this masquerade of style architectures and become again functional. So they confronted historic industrial buildings with quite modern ones. They showed Peter Behrens' turbine hall was just 1 year old at the time of the publication of this brochure. That was quite interesting. And in the historic part, they made a choice of functional types of technical industrial buildings like this factory, and they confronted it with here Bruno Taut's water turbine hall for a Ruhrgebiet steel factory. So in very drastic confrontation, they wanted to make the point that architects should again remember the functional qualities of early industrial building. And for the time really remarkable is the frontispiece of their journal. It was published in 1910, I said, and this is the Krupp Steelworks in Rheinhausen, only 2 years old. So the historic monuments people moved suddenly in the world of absolutely contemporary buildings. In my eyes, a very, very progressive perspective. Really an early example of a wakefulness for the quality of historic architecture, but not only being interested in a historic way, wanting to employ it for today's necessities and to make the didactical approach to better the quality of industrial architecture. At the same time, a very interesting new journal came to life called Der Industriebau, Industrial Building. And at the conference of the Rheinische Association of Historic Monuments people, the first issue of this new journal was distributed. And what you can see here, again on the frontispiece, is very modern architecture. This is the 1909 reinforced concrete gas holder in Dresden, in the city of Leipzig, only 1 year old. And this journal made it its main purpose to further the quality of contemporary industrial architecture. And for this purpose, they asked modern architects, like here Paul Bonatz, to publish their buildings, their newest buildings. This is an East German grain mill as an example of a modified way of modernity, perhaps, but still a very unhistorical kind of industrial architecture. When I had the privilege to work together with Barry Trinder in the 1990s, doing this Blackwell's Encyclopedia of Industrial Archaeology, I was made Western European editor, and I learned something in preparing this book together with Barry, that there was a special quality to the early modernism in Germany. You had a couple of architects, prominent architects, who did not hesitate to take commissions for industrial buildings. Industrial building was not very high ranking in the ranks of architectural tasks, but here you have the phenomenon that really the leading architects of the time did not hesitate to do industrial buildings. In the Czech Republic, very interestingly, you have the same phenomenon. Many of the modernists here did not hesitate to do very good industrial buildings. Same, by the way, in Catalonia, where the Modernismo architects also from very early on did industrial buildings. So you have a hidden stream of modernity going through the industrial architecture. I think justifying this saying that the factory building is at the core of the 20th century. This distinguished gentleman here is not an entrepreneur, but the son of an entrepreneur, which put him into the luxurious role of having to spend a lot of money, and he decided to spend it on cultural purposes. He was a citizen of the Ruhrgebiet, and he said, this Ruhrgebiet is without any culture. We are very successful in producing steel and digging up coal, but culture is not so highly developed, and we have to do something about it. So Karl Ernst Osthaus, also member of the German Werkbund, decided to do something about it. And he commissioned Walter Gropius to set up an exhibition of exemplary industrial architecture, which was put together in 1911 and then traveling around widely. So he was quite important for the furthering of this aim that also the journal Industriebau furthered, improving the quality of industrial quality. This man, you know, this is Walter Gropius. He did this exhibition of exemplary industrial buildings, showing works of other German architects in proto-modernity. This is Peter Behrens, the gasworks in Frankfurt. We will have a look at Peter Behrens a minute later. He is a proto-modernist. He is not a real avant-garde modernist, but he was very important in getting rid of ornamentation in buildings, like Adolf Loh's later famous saying, ornament is crime. And you have examples for this in the first decade of the 20th century. Here we jump into another building material from iron and steel into reinforced concrete. This is the Breslau Wroclaw Market Hall, still in use today. You see it in daily use with its wonderful parabolic span. And these examples were widely published at the time. In this exhibition of exemplary industrial buildings, Mr. Gropius also included Southern American and American silos, grain stores. Here in an example from Argentina, Bunge y Born. And it's quite interesting how the reception of this stuff was. Here you have the original, authentic photography of this grain store, and here you see something Mr. Corbusier used in one of his publications. It was not modern enough for him because it still had these pediments, so he got rid of them in photocopying away certain elements he did not consider modern enough. I mentioned the German Werkbund in 1907, setting up this association to further the aims of good design production. And the yearbook in 1913 was entirely dedicated to works of industry and trading. 1 year later, they did a similar publication on buildings of traffic, making propaganda for a clearly contemporary modern articulation of industrial architectural aims. And in this 1913 publication, you have again here Peter Behrens' gasworks, and then you have here chemical factories by Mr. Bonatz. Yeah, thank you, by Hans Pölzig, as an example of exemplary modernist buildings. You notice there is a certain expressionist element also. This is specific for German industrial architecture. They came from many sides into modernity, reinterpreting even Gothic building styles by transposing them into some expressionistic language. And here you have quite a good example for that. It's a book of 1992, in my eyes, giving a good representation of what was happening. It is half-time of modernity. That's exactly, you can say, for this period of the first decade of it was not yet a modernity into the Bauhaus direction and the Bauhaus definition, but it was definitely a big step forward from historicist architecture, half-time of modernity. And Mr. Behrens was quite an interesting example for that. In 1909, he constructed the silk mill near Potsdam, Hermann Muthesius, in 1909 for a big concern, being rhythmical and modern in one way, but still carrying along some traditional elements. Again, he did so in his transmission station in Nauen, west of Berlin. If you compare it to a contemporary Dutch building here, Kootwijk in the Netherlands, a same purpose, a transmission building, of course you see the real modernity here in full splendor compared to this one by Mr. Behrens. Muthesius did an interesting thing insofar as he repeated his Potsdam pattern 10 years later in 1922 on a smaller scale. If you compare this one with this one, you have the same elements here all over again. This building survived in comparison to the Potsdam one, which was destroyed in the war. It's still there with this beautiful lions. It's the trademark of the silk factory. And we were lucky insofar as we Oh no, I thought I had a picture of the interior. It is still used in its original shape, the undivided spinning hall still there. It's a store for building materials now, so we're quite lucky to have an early example of this halftime of modernity. Now Behrens is a big name, Peter Behrens, and he developed a specific language of modernity based on tradition. This is a pavilion on an exhibition for a linoleum factory. And here you have his signet developed for this firm, for the propaganda material of the firm, showing his building. And you have a specific combination of quadrangle and circle, which was a real trademark for Mr. Behrens. In the 1920s, he built an automobile factory in Berlin. And again, here you have this specific motive that he employed. Behrens is important insofar as he became one of the early developers of something later called corporate design. The electrical firm of AEG, Allgemeine Elektrizitätswerke, in Berlin made him chief designer in 1907. It was a new job, and he got the commission to design everything for this concern, from the buildings to the products they had. This is a toaster designed by Mr. Behrens. And then you have his most prominent work, the famous Turbine Hall of 1909, which in my eyes is one of the most non-modernist buildings around. It has become an icon of modern industrial architecture. In my eyes, this temple-like front only disguises the real quality, which was done by his companion Karl Bernhard, the engineer, who really created the modernity of this turbine hall, which you can see here during the building process. This is the true shape, and Behrens has more or less only covered it up. There was a controversy from the beginning. Both Behrens and Karl Bernhard published from the beginning, arguing against each other. Behrens argued, without me, it would not be an icon, and Karl Bernhard said, without me, the clear constructive quality of this building wouldn't be there. He designed an interesting work in Glasgow, by the way, Karl Bernhard. So you have an ambivalent concept of modernity in this famous example of the Turbine Hall in Berlin. In my eyes, this much earlier, 5 years earlier, erected building in the Ruhrgebiet is much more modern. It's a 1904 central machine hall of a coal mine called Zollern. And here you have the clear functional appearance of the steel glass architecture honestly shown to the outside. There are some elements in here which camouflage this a bit. These Art Nouveau. This is Mr. Möhring, who stole the design from the Paris metro entrances. He was later commissioned to add these elements. We were lucky later on insofar as we could sell this building as an Art Nouveau industrial building, which helped for the survival of it. But here, I think you can clearly see the modernity in comparison to Behrens' monumentality. How modern it was, you can see the original drawings for this machine hall were like that, a combination of neo-Gothic and neo-Renaissance brickwork, and then they did it like that. So modernity, again, in a clear design. One step later, but we still had a Kaiser in Germany. This architecture was designed in 1911. What they call the first curtain wall in Germany, we have seen 8 years before that. In 1903, we had this teddy bear factory, but still it became an icon of modernity with this cutaway corner here, the Fagus works. Fagus means beechwood. What they produced, and still produce today, by the way, is shoe lasts made of beechwood. Next year we will have a big celebration here for 100 years of Bauhaus, so there will be an exhibition in this building. We have already seen this modernity coming out of an expressionism as an example. And in 1914, this Werkbund made a big exhibition in Cologne, and Mr. Gropius designed a sort of repetition of his Fagus works as a model factory in this exhibition. It was surprised by the outbreak of the First World War, so they closed down early, but again, it was a manifest of modernity. As I said, building material next to iron of modernity was reinforced concrete, and then one of the most famous examples also from the first decade of the 20th century were Louis Kahn's buildings for a fort, where this conveyor belt method of producing things was translated into the language of architecture. After the First World War, it took quite a while before Germany, again, having to pay heavy reparations till industry lived up again. And from this period, the early 1920s, you have quite another prominent Behrens building, now of a clear modernity in comparison to the turbine hall. The main storage for a big steel concern of the Ruhrgebiet in Oberhausen. Slightly Frank Lloyd Wrightish in my eyes, but of a clear modern language. Is now the seat of our Industrial Technical Museum in the Rhineland, and of a clear language. Translated into greater orders of bigness is the Central Market Hall in Frankfurt by Martin Elsässer in 1928, which is a very impressive, really a manifesto of modernity. Regrettably, they made the decision to put the seat of the European Central Bank in here and commissioned a rather silly Viennese firm of architects called Coop Himmelblau, Heaven Blue, to do the enlargement, which sort of, here you have the original hall, which here looks really monumental. It's dwarfed at the feet of the new building. Well, nothing you can do about that. It happened. But in the same order, you have a 500-meter-long factory comparable to Frankfurt in Torino, the Fiat Lingotto works, with that famous race course on top. There is a famous photograph of Franziska sitting in a car full of fear, stemming her hands against the window pane, with a test driver still running up there. It has stopped working in the early 1990s, and Mr. Renzo Piano got the commission to do something modern in here. It's part of the university, but also firms, and a helicopter landing pad on top. But the race course is still there as another expression of the new vehicle of the 20th century, the motor car. So the building has been preserved this way. Last example, in the Netherlands, the tea, coffee, and what is the third one? Coffee, tea, and tobacco, thanks. Factory of Vanelle by Brinkmann and van der Vlucht. Very clearly intended as a statement of modernity, as an element of sanitary working places full of light and air. Again, a curtain wall construction clearly visible. And again, a lucky case of reuse. It's in its entirety still there. So to sum up all this rapid gallop through the concept of modernity in the industrial buildings, I will end with 3 examples where the UNESCO at least woke up to this quality, to the importance of this period and this pioneer role for the development of the architecture as a whole, not only in industrial context. In 2001, this coal mine from 1928 was made World Heritage Site. In 1911, the already shown Fagus works were included into the list, and in 2014, the Vanelle factory joined the family. So at least one can say it's a recognition of the importance of this movement. And with that, I thank you for your patience listening to me. Thanks.